Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Brookings, India. Today's development seminar is by Neeraj Kaushal. She's a professor of social policy at the Columbia School of Social Works. She's also associated with NBR. And we're very glad to have Neeraj talk on immigration and its discontents. We will talk of different countries, including the US and Brexit. For those of you who are here to particularly listen to Trump, I think that's just one small segment of her analysis. But this is a global phenomenon, and the discontents are being felt. There are undercurrents which are fairly global. And Neeraj is going to address. This is part of a book which is forthcoming. So Neeraj, welcome. You have an hour. We will take questions at the end because it helps in the recording, and it also keeps the conversation flowing in a way that we can manage. So an hour for the talk, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. Thank you.
And then I'll move on to, is immigration a crisis? We always hear things about immigration is a problem that needs a solution. Immigration is a crisis that needs to be addressed. It's creating problem, political and economic. So I'm going to look at with you as to whether immigration is a crisis. And from there I move on to see what really are the triggers of these discontents. We do see the political, economic discontents all over the world. And is immigration a cause or a scapegoat? From there I'll move on to talk a little bit about what are the forces that propel immigration. Can immigration be restricted? And then I'll have a few concluding thoughts. Now, immigration is a hot button issue, right? It's shaking electoral politics all over the world. Post 2010, which is the period that I will be talking about. Let's see if this works. Oh, it is.
Okay. So Neeraj, are you going to define what discontent means?
Yes, yeah. So post 2010, we see most of Europe veering towards the far right, with anti-immigration political parties booming. It's become a norm. In France, we have the National Front. In Italy, the Northern League and the Five Star Movement. In Austria, there's the Freedom Party. And then we have Danish People's Party in Denmark, and so on. Most of Europe, you have political parties that have either strengthened over the years or have emerged that are anti-immigration. And on the other side of the Atlantic, we have the Trump phenomena, President Donald Trump, who came to power on the promise that he will build a wall along the southern border, even though there is a wall already there, but he wants to have double-layer wall, and he would like Mexicans to pay for it. During the campaign, he called immigrants from Mexico rapists and criminals. He also said that if elected to power, he will ban immigration of Muslims. Now, that's also not just, so we see that happening in the US for the last several years, but that it's not just United States and Europe. In Singapore in 2013, Singaporeans said, we want Singapore for Singaporeans. There's so many Singaporeans in the same sentence, I know, but the government of Singapore then changed its policy, even though it was a little bit too affected their economic interests. Here in India, we have a few years ago, Amit Shah said that we will build a wall with Bangladesh such that not a bird will be allowed to come in. Not just that, many East Asian countries, Malaysia and Thailand, for instance, had in 2015 and 16, they had boatloads of Bangladeshi and Rohingya migrants who were abandoned mid-sea. Malaysia also reneged on a promise to allow many low-skilled immigrants for Bangladesh. And then finally, not the least, is Brexit. Brexit, if you remember, one of the major causes of Brexit was, surveys showed, was immigration. So The question is, we saw similar kinds of things about 100 years ago that led to many countries, led by the United States, restricting immigration. So many people are asking this question, will history repeat itself? And to some extent, this rising popularity of right-wing political parties kind of gives you the feeling that, yes, maybe the process has begun. Many countries have responded to the discontent within their countries by restrictive policies, stronger enforcement, increased electronic and human cross-border surveillance, by constructing walls, fence, and other physical barriers. There are also countries and regions that have used carrot and stick policy. For instance, EU has often given aid to countries in lieu of restricting immigration. The most recent one was EU giving $6 billion to Turkey over a period of time on the condition that they do not let Syrian refugees into the EU. It was a more complicated formula, but the objective was to restrict immigration. Similarly, they've given funding to Jordan, about 3 billion euros, on the promise that Syrian refugees in Jordan are integrated, given employment, so that they don't have an incentive to come to the EU. Beyond that, beyond these policies, we've also seen at least movement of refugees decline. In 2015, 1 million Syrian refugees came to the EU. In 2016, the number had fallen to a third. So the question really is, whether they're going to be a restrictive immigration policy. And again, just to carry on with the same thought, at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, there were 3 to 10 fences around the world. By now, it's 65 walls or fences that separate countries. So Hungary has built a wall of 280 miles. Morocco has a wall with Western Sahara. Greece has built a wall with Turkey, and so on and so forth. So many countries are responding to all this by creating far more surveillance. Here I have about 11 of them. I took this from The Guardian, and you can see how so many countries around the world are building fences and barriers. Now, how do immigrants respond to these fences and barriers? The evidence shows that there is not necessarily a decline in immigration. Evidence shows that immigrants generally resort to more difficult, perilous paths. That leads to more accidents, that leads to death. It just makes immigration more difficult, but not necessarily brings it down. So I would say that there is some evidence that that countries are responding to these discontents by imposing restrictive policies, but there is not much evidence that these policies would be successful. But before we go on to that topic of immigration and discontents, let me ask another question and try to answer that. Are these discontents related to immigration? We see discontents all across Europe, many countries around the world, and I'm going to give you some evidence to suggest that no, they are not. And I'll give you 4 or 5 examples. For instance, I'll start with Brexit. Brexit, at the time, we all thought that immigration was the primary cause why most people were saying they wanted to leave the UK to leave the EU. But when the UK election results came, they showed that the top 10 districts with the lowest leave vote, that is, population 30% or less of their population voted to leave, they had between 28 to 45% of their population was foreign born. On the other extreme, 10 districts that had voted for Brexit. So in these districts, 70% of the population or more voted for Brexit. There, only 2.9 to 15% was foreign born. So this is one evidence that yes, there were discontent, there was public dialogue about immigration is a problem, but if you look at the data in detail, you see that no, there's something else going on. I'll give you some more examples. For instance, EU, countries with the lowest level of immigration are the most vocally showed discontent, and they say that they don't want immigration. Poland is one of them, which has said that they would not like to have any refugees from Syria being resettled there. Poland has one of the lowest levels of immigration. In fact, in EU, in fact, in many of the charts that you look at, OECD charts on immigration, Poland doesn't figure there. Seems that about 2% of their population is foreign born, 2 to 4%. The average for EU is 11%. Hungary is another country that has actually responded by building a wall to the Syrian influx. 6% of their population is foreign born. Countries in Europe that have seen tremendous growth in immigration. For instance, Spain saw its immigrant population increase from 5 to 15% within a course of about 10 years. Ireland, similarly, huge increase in immigrant population. These two countries don't have any national level political parties that are against immigration, whereas most other European countries have national level parties that have strengthened over the years. Now let me say something about the US. I know a little more about US immigration than immigration in other countries. In the United States, states that have the largest number of immigrants are the most generous towards immigrants, are the most welcoming of immigrants. I live in New York. New York, even as all these things are going on at the federal level, where the environment for immigration is becoming more and more ugly. New York has, they have funding that any undocumented person who's deported, for their legal course, they can get state funding. New York gives funding for health insurance to undocumented children. New York City, this government colleges in New York City provide tuition subsidy to undocumented children. More important than all of that is about 2 or 3 years ago, New York started a New York ID, which was basically a way of providing ID to undocumented. So this was, in a way, amnesty for undocumented within New York City. And when they collected the information from people who were given IDs, they immediately wiped off their records. They didn't want the undocumented to feel that this ID would be used to actually track them or hound them in future. They also gave huge incentives for New York elite to actually take the ID. So you can get discount for Broadway shows. If you have a New York ID, you can get metro travel discounts. You can get discounts at restaurants. So there is the point of all this, that there are places with very high levels of immigration, but there's no discontent. And then there are places within the United States where there's much less immigration, but there's a lot of discontent. Let me give the last example about the Syrian refugee crisis. Europe has received about 1 million Syrian refugees in a population of 500 million. Other smaller countries in the Middle East, Turkey and Lebanon. Lebanon has 25% of its population consists of refugees. Turkey has received 3.5 million 3 million Syrian refugees. That's about 3.5% of their population. So Turkey has received, not only in volume terms, but also in percentage terms, much larger proportion of Syrian refugees. And the acceptance that you see in Turkey of Syrian refugees is much, much higher. And that could also be because of the culturally people find themselves to be similar to Syrian refugees. In fact, with a colleague of mine, I did some study about attitudes towards refugees in Turkey, and a majority of people actually say that it's their humanitarian obligation to help refugees from Syria. So the attitude towards refugees or immigrants are not necessarily determined by the volume and pace of immigration. But yet, despite all these reasons that I'm giving you, we know that there are very palpable discontent. Some countries are using the in some countries, the ultra-conservative parties are basically merely reflecting the views of the public. But in a large number of countries, they're actually using public fears to spread their own agenda, exclusionist agenda. So I believe, and I'm going to try to give a lot more evidence through this talk, is that primary cause of discontents is neither the volume or the pace of immigration, but basically the appetite of countries to accept and absorb immigrants. Now, before we go back to the causes of discontent, let me just say something more about most of the time when we talk about immigration, mostly in this media, you see that they talk about immigration being a problem. It's a crisis that needs to be addressed. It's a problem. And what I'm going to say is that immigration actually is one of the least flourished dimensions of globalization. The other dimensions of globalizations have been much, much bigger. So in 1990, the proportion of world population that lived away from their country of birth was 3%. 90 years later, in 1991, it was still the same 3%. 17 years later, when everybody is talking about all these discontent, the population is still that same 3%. So immigration has been merely keeping in pace with the growth in population around the world. Look at the other dimensions of globalization. Here I give you this data on export to GDP ratio, world exports to world GDP ratio. So in 1870, 5% of the world exports to GDP ratio was about 5%. In 1991, it was 20%. And in 2015, after all this, the financial crisis and declines or stagnation of exports, is still 29%. The other, oftentimes, the other dimension of globalization that we talk about is the foreign direct investments. So here I give you data only from 1971. We start in 1971, I think about 10 billion in US dollars, constant dollars, in 1971 foreign direct investment was 10 billion. About 20 years later, it increased to about, I think, $500 billion. But if you see it here, even after the Great Recession and the financial crisis, the level of foreign direct investment is many, many times more than what it was just 30 or 40 years ago. So even at a time when everybody is talking about end of globalization, deglobalization, and we still see very high level of foreign direct investment. We see high levels of of exports to GDP ratio, and other more important dimensions of globalization, technology, internet, cost of travel, and time to travel. They have declined so much over time, and they are continue to decline. The cost of travel, cost of communication has continued to decline. But immigration is in a way the same as a proportion of GDP. So beyond that, I would say it's not just the volume and level of immigration, but also how immigration takes place. When you say that immigration is a crisis, you actually get the feeling that there are these immigrants who can't be stopped. But the reality of immigration is that a large proportion of immigration around the world, a vast majority of it, happens through legal channels. So those of you, I'm sure all of you have had international travels, and you know how difficult it is to get a visa. You have to inform the consulate offices wherever you're going a lot about your wealth, your ability to buy the ticket. In many countries you also buy health insurance. In order to get immigration visa, immigration permit, you have to provide a lot more information. So it's a highly regulated process. It's not a process where people are just stealthily going across other countries to other countries. It's a very, very regulated process. And immigration has increased because of the declining cost of travel, because there's a huge middle class in emerging economies who have the aspiration as well as the money to travel and live in other countries. And finally, less restrictive policies. Even as we see many countries talking about having these discontents about immigration, we have seen over the last 3 decades increasingly barriers to travel have decreased. Barrier to travel has decreased, cost of travel has decreased, and that has led to increase in travel. Okay. You might have also heard people expressing the fear that immigration is going to lead to huge change in populations, and that because most of the sending country have higher population growth, that is a propelling factor why immigration takes place. Now look at this data that I have about population, dispersion of population within 4 regions in the world. In 1980, 21% of the world population was in Europe. In 1990, it increased to about 25%. And since that, it has declined. And by 2050, it would be Europe will have only 7% of the world population. Immigration will do nothing to that. Immigration will not change the proportion of population, maybe slightly, maybe by 0.5%, but not more than that. Looking at the appetite Europe has for immigrants, it won't be more than that. Look at Africa. Africa had about 9 to 10% of the population before 1990. Its share is increasing. And there is a fear. When I was interviewing people about Brexit, one of the fear that they have was the UK doesn't have the capacity to absorb more immigrants. The EU doesn't have the capacity. But you can see the population dynamic is changing. Asia always had about 60% of the world population. It will continue to have the same. But Europe is geographically shrinking. Now let me come back to the main topic of this talk, which is what are really the drivers of anxiety around the world? What are the factors that are shaking politics? I have put 7 factors here. And what I'm going to basically do is look at each one of them and say how immigration is related to them. So culture and identity is a major problem. Every country that's receiving, actually not only countries, within communities, within countries, the issue of culture becomes big. Changes in demographic factor, that could be a cause of these discontents. In Western countries especially, productivity stagnation has been one of the, along with rising inequality or stagnation in wages. The next factor is loss in confidence in government. So anti-establishment votes that have increased, not just in the Western countries, but all over the world. Then rise of refugee movements in the last 5-6 years, and finally international terrorism and national security. And what I'm going to do is see how each of them is related to immigration, and whether we can attribute any of these causes to immigration. So culture and identity issue. Absorptive capacity of immigrants differs across nations. But I believe it's not often related to the size of immigrant flows. So for instance, Japan has a very low tolerance towards immigrants. Poland, I earlier discussed that, has very low tolerance towards immigrants. Both countries also have low immigration. Canada has very high tolerance. Canada, in fact, is probably the most tolerant country towards immigrants at this stage. It also has very high level of immigration. US, states and cities in the US that have very high level of tolerance also have very high levels of immigration. So you don't see immigration in the US, actually cities that have high levels of immigration, those cities having major protest on immigration. I talked to you earlier about response of Syrian refugees in Europe and the Middle East. So culture and identity are major issue, but it's not always clear whether it's because of immigration. It's because of the flow and pace of immigration that these issues are important. So on the one hand, we find that a high pace of immigration could trigger problems, but on the other hand, places that have high levels of immigration also creates more tolerance towards. So there's more diversity, you are more accepting of diversity. So that's another thing. Increases in co-ethnic population, you also create institutions. Countries and cities that have had a long history of immigration, they also have institutions that cater towards that public, and generally local population accept the presence of immigrants and how institutions should be catering towards their needs. Second, social and demographic change. So why am I saying this could be a cause of discontent? Well, if you see your government providing for services that are mostly needed by immigrants, like for instance dual language policy, or if your city population or local population is largely older, whereas immigrants are younger and the state is spending more on immigrants, that could be a cause of discontent. More than that, if you see more ethnic shops are coming up, if you see the complexion of the locality is changing, that could send fears. Again, I'll repeat the same point that I made earlier, which is that in traditional destinations, there is a lot more tolerance towards the change. They're more accepting of the change. Now, wage stagnation. This is one of the biggest problem of this economic factors for discontents in most Western countries. They have seen a stagnation in wages. And in the US, for instance, since 1970, there was a huge 30-year period when wages stagnated, especially wages of low-skilled workers, men with less than a high school degree, their wages actually declined. Economists have looked at this question about what is the cause of wage decline. In the United States, they've looked at it. Most of this research is about, is it technology or foreign trade? So immigration is a third minor factor, which most people don't even study. So most of the time they come to the conclusion, well, maybe about 40 to 70% of the factors of the wage decline is because of technological change, close to 10% is because of foreign trade, and a distant third factor is immigration. People have also done some research where they look at what is the impact of immigration on wages. So that's a different kind of a question. Instead of answering the question to what extent the decline is explained by immigration, they look at what is the impact of immigration on wages, local wages. And the answer to that question in most studies that have been done in Europe, the answer they found is that it doesn't have any impact. In the US, the studies there are two extremes. There's one set of studies, researchers who find no effect. In fact, they find actually it might actually have a positive impact. And then there are certain other studies, the other group of researchers who actually find a large impact. And I'm happy to talk about these studies later on if you're interested. But let's come back to wage stagnation and inequality. Yes, we've seen inequality rising within countries in all over Europe, in the United States. There's a parallel phenomena that's going on, which is what's going on with inequality within nations. And inequality between nations has actually declined. We also know that extreme poverty in the world has declined, and poverty has declined. This may have nothing to do with immigration, but immigration can be a contributing factor in reducing. So I'm not saying that immigration is causing this, but there are parts of immigration, there are aspects of immigration that can reduce poverty. The fourth factor, productivity stagnation. This is an aspect on which many economists have commented. Western countries in the first 50 or 70 years of the 20th century, they were lucky. They had huge increases in productivity, but over the last 3-4 decades, productivity has been stagnant. Robert Gordon, he's an economist at Northwestern University. He talks about 6 different headwinds, which he says could be causing this productivity stagnation, and he actually predicts that this is going to continue. So he talks about demography, education, inequality, globalization, energy, environment, global and consumer and government debt. I will talk about only demography because that's something that's related to immigration. Now, this is a chart that I prepared from UNDP data on world population prospects. So the demographers are very good in predicting projecting what the population is going to be. And let's start here with Japan, which is the bottom black line. Japan reached the highest working age population. It's in 1995 or so. Since then, its working age population, has been declining. By 2050, these projections show that they will decline by about a quarter. We know what's been going on with the Japanese economy. It has been in an economic stagnation since 1990, so for about 30 years now. Next, I would like you to look at the gray line that represents China. So China, we all know that about 30 years ago, China was so worried about its population problems, like they had the single child policy. By now, those worries have receded, and now they are worried about what is going to happen to their working age population. So Chinese government, Communist Party, has been very openly saying that the biggest challenge to their economic growth is talent. And this chart shows that their working age population peaks at 2010, and China in the next 40 years will see a decline in their working age population by 150 million. That's a huge number. Yeah? And they are worried about where are they. They openly talk about talent, but because so far they've been receiving a lot of labor from rural areas. But once that source of labor declines, they'll worry about even low-skilled workers. India, of course, we will be reaping the demographic dividend. I mean, we'll have to really improve the quality of our workforce to reap that dividend. North America, you see that line, it's which includes basically Canada, United States, and Mexico, and their working age population will continue to grow, and part of the increase is because of immigration. Europe, the working age populations stagnates, peaks at around 2010, and it begins to decline after that. So between 2010 and 2050, you see 100 million, a 20% decline in their working age population. So these are the kind of numbers we are talking about when we talk about demographic headwinds that will impact productivity in future. Now, population changes are happening, and most of the time these things are not that shouldn't worry us. They worry us because it's the ratio of working age population to those who are outside the working age group. And you see that this chart gives the working dependency ratio. This demographer call it dependency ratio, and you see it increasing in many countries of the world. Basically, in Africa, And India, we don't see, but most of the other countries you have in the chart, especially developed countries, you see the dependency ratio increasing. Now, having said all that about immigration, I don't really believe that immigration will be able to rescue countries from their demographic demise. Immigration may be able to, in the short term, be of some help. And actually, we did see that in the 70s and 80s, countries that followed change policies where they encouraged immigration, these countries saw their fertility rate improve and their fertility rate increase up to the level of replacement rate. United States happens, so you can just compare United States and some EU countries or Japan, and you'll see the stark difference that immigration policy made in these countries. United States had the same level of fertility rate as Japan and many European EU countries, or the EU average in 1970. US changed its policy, encouraged immigration. The interesting thing about immigrants is that they mostly migrate in the age group when they're very high. They have high productivity, and they also are in the most reproductive phase of their lives. So immigrants have more children. They generally come from cultures where fertility rates are higher, slightly higher. As a result of which, US saw its fertility rate go up to the replacement rate by 1980s, and it has continued to be at that level, whereas other countries, Japan saw a sharp decline in its fertility rate, and similarly. The next factor that I was talking about was a lack of confidence in governments. That has been one of the factors uh, that has led to discontent. People just don't believe that the government can deliver the goods or the services that they expect from the government. And during especially the Great Recession, public in many countries came to believe that the governments are basically going to rescue big banks, and they're not doing anything uh, to help with other people who are affected by the Great Recession. So many people have used terms like anti-establishment votes. In 2009, in the 50 most populous democracy, the governing party won 90% of the elections. In 2016, that number has gone down to 40%. People have low confidence not only in the government's ability to deliver, but they also have low confidence in the government's ability to actually stick to their promises on immigration. So David Cameron, for instance, came to power on the promise that immigration would be reduced to tens of thousands. And he's repeated that promise every year of his prime ministership, but throughout that period, immigration was over 200,000 every year. So public lost confidence in the government ability or willingness to actually deliver on their promise. Here, the illegal immigration, government's ability to restrict illegal immigration or undocumented immigration becomes very important. Increase in undocumented immigration has also led to this fear that the governments are either unwilling or they don't have the ability to restrict immigration. I think one of the reasons why this is causing a lot of discontent is that governments are unwilling to have a candid dialogue on immigration. What are the costs of immigration? What are the benefits of immigration? Why immigration is important or not important? Who will benefit from it? Whether it's the nation that's going to benefit. Immigration is overall, most economists who've done the studies, they find that immigration has an overall positive effect on the country. But then the distribution effect of immigration could be very different. Regions that may receive high immigration initially, they may have they have to face more fiscal cost of immigration, whereas all the benefits of immigration are national. So this kind of dialogue is never carried out in countries, and that could be one of the reasons for the discontents. Now, increase in refugee flows, and this is quite related to um, to what we see in the mass media. We see on the internet images of refugees, crossing walls, boatloads of refugees coming to countries, and that has sent a lot of fear. Fear that refugees are for countries that are caught in a civil war. Fear that these wars are breeding grounds for international terrorism. Fears that most actors engaged in civil war have a negative fear that Western countries and cultures have, uh, they've generated these fears that among thousands of these refugees would be people who would be a terrorist, and they fear that this would that refugees flows would also bring terrorists with them. Now again, these fears have become much more after the Great Recession, especially when many European countries were themselves reeling under recession, when their unemployment rate was very high, that they were unwilling to accept refugees. And finally, terrorism. There's nothing much I can say about terrorism. I can only say that there are studies in the US which shows that immigrants are less likely to be involved in crime. Immigrant flows are not related to crime rates, that the places where immigrants go, crime rate is low, and that could partly be because immigration is a very selective process. You go to places where there's more harmony. But the fear or any instance of terrorist attack anywhere in the world send that fear through the public that this could happen to us, or that immigrants are going to, that refugees are bringing, could be terrorists. And that fear, any instance of terrorism anywhere in the world just triggers that reaction. So, by this talk so far, I'm kind of trying to give you evidence or say that immigration is not the only driver of discontent, and I believe that it is not the primary driver of the discontents. Now, the next question would be, if it is not a driver of discontent and countries are trying to restrict immigration, can it be restricted? Countries are following policy to restrict immigration, and is it possible to restrict immigration in a globalized world? So technically speaking, yes, it can be possible. A huge proportion of immigration happens through airways, and in most countries, airways are highly regulated, both in the sending country and in the receiving country. So technically speaking, yes, countries can do that, but except for a couple of countries, Australia, New Zealand, island nations, where countries have been able to regulate immigration very effectively. In most other parts of the world, immigration enforcement is a messy thing, creates mess. And from there, the question is, if it creates a mess, the question you need to ask is, at what cost do you want to restrict immigration? When most politicians talk about restricting immigration, they basically talk about immigration. And I'm now here going to relate immigration to mobility. And you might actually say that, well, nobody is saying that restrict mobility. The thing is, without restricting mobility, it's just impossible to regulate immigration. So international mobility is much higher than international migration. About 5 million new migrants worldwide go from one country to another, settle into another country other than the country of their birth. International mobility is much higher. We don't have estimates of all the level of mobility, but international tourist arrivals, World Bank gives out this data, and their data shows that in I have this data for 2014, but 2015 also is the same. It's about 1.2 billion. Now, this data relates to number of arrivals and not actual number of people. So you have to make some kind of an adjustment in terms of how many travels anybody took in a year. And depending on what assumption you make, even if you make an assumption that a person travels 5 times across international borders, it again is a very large number. 200 million is a huge number. That's 40 times the number of international migrants. Now, if you restrict immigration and not restrict international mobility, then there'll be a lot of people who will stay beyond their visa status, right? And that will lead to more irregular immigration or undocumented immigration, but it will not completely remove immigration or eliminate immigration. Now, any kind of restriction on international mobility can be very, very messy. So a few months ago, when President Trump became president, he actually announced that travelers from 7 Islamic countries should be banned. That created utter chaos at airports. That led to a lot of protest in major cities in the United States. Not only that, state governments and local governments were against them. They took the federal government to the court. Universities were upset with that. They took the government to the court, and corporations were upset about it. So can you imagine 7 countries that provide a very small proportion of overall travelers to the US? If that leads to that kind of a chaos, a more general implementation of policy of restricting mobility, what will that lead to? Beyond the fact that it's going to create a chaos, it's also most Western countries want to have immigrants from travelers from other parts of the world. So one way of Europe to partake with Chinese prosperity is to invite Chinese travelers to come and spend their money in Paris or other European countries. Same thing in the United States. So world tourism industry, international tourism industry is $1 trillion industry. Nobody wants to restrict that. So there are, on the one side, countries are struggling with these identity issues. On the other side, there is the economic issue as to whether immigrants should be or travelers should be invited to the country. How much time do I have? Time. Okay. So let me just talk about more generally the effects of immigration. Okay. You can look at impacts of immigration in 2 ways. There are the national impacts, that are economic impacts that are mostly positive, and then the distributional impact. Who gets benefit from immigration, who gets a short-term benefit from immigration, and who gets a long-term benefit from immigration. And whether immigrants are actually displacing resident populations, or immigrants are reducing the opportunities of resident workers. And in many countries, including the United States, they found that immigration, especially of low-skilled workers, they're basically, in many occupations and industries, they are affecting the opportunities of immigrants who had arrived earlier, or they are impacting the opportunities of very low-skilled immigrants. And most of the time, it's the jobs that native populations are not willing to do, that immigrants often do. And we do see that there's so all around the world, countries are fighting for in competition with other countries to attract skilled labor. And I predict that that's going to happen with low-skilled labor as well, that most countries, as the population trends that I showed you, will lead to a scarcity of unskilled labor as well. And although immigration will not solve the problem, although we'll see increase in robotization to meet with the declining populations, I think countries that keep their doors open to immigrants have the advantage, the economic advantage. Um, Finally, when there are a lot of people talking about globalization, how globalization is, we've reached a point where Western countries don't want globalization, they are restricting globalization. And that might have some impact on immigration as well. Whether that would restrict immigration or, see, globalization and immigration are quite mutually enhancing processes. There was a time, maybe about 25 years ago, when most Western countries thought that globalization would lead to reduction in immigration. In fact, many of the trade agreements were, NAFTA, for instance, was signed on the assumption that this will move industry to Mexico and would reduce immigration to the US. But because immigration improves opportunities in the receiving because globalization improves opportunities in the receiving countries, people have more income and they can travel. Mexico and US case was somewhat different in the sense that agriculture, because of NAFTA, agriculture got really negatively affected. So many farmers decided to move to the US. Because their currency also declined, peso declined sharply, so immigration to the US was more effective. So over a longer period of time, say 30 years later, we've seen some decline in immigration, but generally there's no clear trend as to whether globalization will reduce immigration. In many places we see that immigration will increase. Whether the current atmosphere of reducing immigration or reducing globalization or anti-globalization move, whether that would have an impact on immigration, I'm not very sure. Most people say that globalization is largely has become is much more closely related to technology and not so much to trade or foreign investment. And technology is not within the control of any country. So I don't think, I mean, maybe I'm an optimist. I don't think this is the end of globalization. And I don't even think that this is the end of immigration. And I'll give you 2 or 3 reasons why I think that this is not the end of immigration. Part of the reason is that there was a time about 100 years ago when most immigration was from Europe to the United States or to the Americas. Immigration has now become a very global phenomena. So immigration just to Europe or just to the United States, a very small proportion of overall immigration in the world. A huge proportion of immigration takes place within Asia. A huge proportion, about 20% of all immigration takes place within Africa. So within various parts of the world, immigration is taking place. So countries that decide to restrict immigration will have to basically suffer because of that. I think I'll just end there. Yeah, thanks.